Hey guys! So far, we have been speaking about selection that is natural. Why natural? Because it is caused by the environment. But did you know that selection can also be caused by people? And in that case, we refer to it as artificial selection. Welcome to my video on artificial selection. Enjoy! What is artificial selection? Artificial selection is when we purposefully select certain characteristics. Why? In order to make species more useful to people, right? So artificial selection is when humans are the selective force, okay? And their selection is based on what is desirable to humans. It is the same process as natural selection, right? Except that a person and not nature is selecting certain characteristics that are important. If we look at a definition for artificial selection, we would say artificial selection refers to the breeding of plants and animals. Why? For the characteristics that are considered desirable to humans. Now, since particular desirable characteristics are selected, it is also known as selective breeding. Where can artificial production be used? Artificial production can be used to increase food quantity. Let's take a look at cows. By selecting cows which produce large amounts of milk and whose mothers and grandmothers were also high milk producers, and allowing them to mate with bulls whose mothers and grandmothers were also high milk producers, what will be developed then will be cows that produce more milk than their ancestors. Now, by deliberate selection of polyploid plants, bigger plants of watermelons and marigolds and snapdragons have been produced. What are polyploid plants? They are plants that inherit 2 or more complete sets of chromosomes. Now, artificial selection can also ensure that a combination of these desirable characteristics, which may appear independently in different organisms, appears in the same set of offspring. For example, a breeder may cross a meaty male sheep with a woolly female sheep. What do you think will happen? Some of the offspring would show a combination of these 2 desirable characteristics, right? Like a meaty sheep with a lot of wool. These offspring are then going to be bred with each other. And then what happens? This process will continue until the sheep with a large amount of meat and a large amount of wool is produced. Now, artificial selection was practiced long before Darwin explained the value of natural selection by the environment. Okay? It was used, for example, in producing the many regional variety of dogs that are man's companion. Now, with people's improved understanding of genetics over the past century, artificial selection has become an exact science that has an enormous influence on the world. Let's take a look at a domesticated animal example of artificial selection. Let's look at cattle. Now, cattle were first domesticated about 10,000 years ago. Where? In the Middle East. A wild animal called the aurochs was domesticated. Why? Because it had many uses. For example, it was a convenient source of food such as milk, meat, and blood. It could carry heavy loads and it could pull plows. This animal's hides could also be used to make clothes and shoes. About 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, a local variety of aurochs was domesticated. Where? In the Indus Valley on the Indian subcontinent. Now these gave rise to the humped or zebu cattle. All our modern breeds of cattle have developed from the aurochs. But the aurochs became extinct when the last one died in Poland in the year 1627. Now cattle farmers have used artificial selection to develop many special breeds of cattle from the original domesticated ones. For example, artificial selection has been used to develop breeds with special characteristics such as high butterfat milk in Jersey cattle, high quality meat in Hereford cattle, resistance to disease and hot climate in Nguni cattle. So the Nguni cattle have been bred to be very disease resistant. Hereford cattle are bred for their meat. Jersey cattle are bred for their rich milk. So these special breeds of cattle have been artificially selected. Let's take a look at a crop example of artificial selection. Yes, artificial selection is also important in breeding crops. Every widely grown crop in the world has been artificially selected. Sometimes it's difficult to know what the original wild plant looked like. For example, maize. Let's use the example of wheat, the most widely grown cereal crop in the world. Wheat grows naturally in a cool climate. It needs special characteristics to be able to grow well in different conditions. Let's take a look at Mexico. Mexico is a very hot, dry country, right? That is dependent on wheat to feed its population. Mexico used to import huge quantities of wheat because it did not grow very well in that Mexican climate. But then, in 1953, an American plant breeder, Dr. Norman Borlaug, started a breeding program in Mexico. What did he do? He selected characteristics in wheat which were more suitable for the local environment. Another common disease of wheat in Mexico was rust. So what did Borlaug do? He started by selecting some rust-resistant wheat plants in Mexico that had been infected by the rust. He used the seeds from these plants to breed new varieties of wheat that would be more resistant to rust infection. At the same time, he found a Japanese wheat, Norin 10, that produced short, thick stems which did not break easily with the weight of the crop. Now, the Nor 10 also needed less water than other wheat varieties. So what did he do then? He interbred the Norin 10 with the American wheat called Brever 14. And what happened was that gave an exceptionally high yield of grain. He then selected the offspring from this cross that had both the most dwarf stems and the highest yield of grain. Then Borlaug crossed this new wheat with some of this rust-resistant varieties. And by careful selection, he got some plants that were high-yielding, dwarf, and resistant to rust. And what do you think happened? By 1963, the wheat harvest in Mexico had increased by 6 times using his new varieties. And then Mexico was able to produce enough wheat for itself as well as for export as well. What was Borlaug responsible for? He was responsible for making his new, more successful varieties by artificially selecting wheat plants with the special characteristics he needed. He has been credited with saving at least 1 billion people from starvation, and his work was the start of the Green Revolution, which has helped the world to feed more people than ever before. Natural selection refers to selection that is based on adaptation to the environment. On the other hand, artificial selection is a type of selection that is based on what is desirable or needed by the humans. With natural selection, the selected individuals are able to survive in the wild since they are able to adapt to their environment, while the artificially selected individuals are only able to survive under controlled conditions since their characteristics were not selected according to adaptation of the environment. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. See you again soon.